Black Tie Optional is a podcast about people who have figured out how to make a great living doing what they love. We share stories about the highs, the lows, and what pushes them daily to achieve their dreams. My name is Philip Benz, and welcome to Black Tie Optional. So Lawrence, you ready to do this thing?
Ready to go.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate you sitting down with me. Thanks a lot for doing that. First thing I want to know, easiest question I have for you is, what's your name and what is it that you have built here in Greenville?
Okay, my name is Lawrence Behr, and what we have here is LBA Group, which consists of the main company plus four appendages, I might call them. One of them is a consulting firm. The other one manufactures some products. The other one does safety training online, and the other one sells products online. So all of this is related to what we call electromagnetics, and that's involving anything that has to do with radio waves, with lightning, with any kind of electrical activity that's basically unwired. We're kind of an unwired outfit, but we deal with radio, TV, cellular, military communications. One of our highlights is that we're the main supplier, the only supplier to the military F-35 program for lightning protection for the F-35s. We have a proprietary system that gets deployed with them when they're on the ramp waiting for action that protects them from lightning. And so that's a fairly recent development, but we've been doing lightning protection for radio towers and all for many years. But anything to do with that is our area of expertise. And so we've grown over the years within that area and are multifaceted.
It's funny you mentioned the F-35 lightning protection. So one of my clients is a private jet company,
Okay.
and one of the guests that I had on the podcast, his name's Sean Callahan. So he heads the paint program at that facility. So painting all the private jets and stuff like that. And one of the questions that I asked him was, how often do planes get struck by lightning? And he said, all the time. All the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned the whole F-35 thing. So, when it comes down to how you got into this, you showed me a picture from when you were 14 years old of you working in a radio station. How'd you go from that to working with, the radio fields and magnetics and all that stuff?
Well, let's step back even a year before that.
Let's do that.
When I was 13, my parents, and my father is Mexican, decided that it would be a good thing for me to go to Cuba for a year to school. And we had hosted a young man my age and his mother for a year while she got her master's degree at ECU, and they were from Havana. And so they invited me to come to Cuba, which I did on my own. I thank my parents for letting me have the freedom that I did. I got on a Atlantic Coastline train in Rocky Mount and rode it to Miami, and a lot of time in the engine, and conductors and engineers like 13-year-old kids.
So you got to sit up in the front of the train.
So I got a lot of good attention there. And when I got to Miami, I went to the airport and got on a Electra, Eastern Airlines Electra, and flew to Havana.
And that was probably a short flight, right? Because Cuba's not that far away.
Oh yeah, very short flight, but it was all quite an adventure to me. But the thing that getting to is, while I was there, my hosts, the Piping, my friend, and his father was president of the Bank of Cuba, and had a lot of connections. And that helped me when I arrived at the airport unannounced. I was
Right.
not expected at that. I was expected a day later. I moved my schedule up, but
Yeah.
so I ended up going into town with the flashing light, police car, and all, taking me to my destination.
Back then, was the whole Cuba America thing? Was that like?
Oh,
Was that?
Cuba was under the direction of Batista
Uh-huh.
just before Castro, and that's what happened when I was there. Castro began working on the fringes of Havana, and it was no longer safe, so I ended up coming back after 2 months instead of a year. But during that 2 months, there was a period of several weeks, 2 weeks perhaps, where my friend, his friend, and I traveled again alone down the whole length of Cuba to a place called Caimanera, which is just across the bay from Guantanamo, and it's sort of the recreational center for, or used to be, for sailors on leave, with all of the attractions. But
Yeah.
it was policed by a Cuban naval detachment, of which one of my friends was, his father was the commandante. And I got to know, while I was there, the radio operator, who happened to be an amateur radio operator as well. And he introduced me to amateur radio, and I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And so when I eventually got back to the States, I had been schooled by him during that couple of weeks in a lot of stuff, and I thought, I've got to go further with this. And so I hit the books and started studying engineering, radio engineering. And a year later, I sat for the FCC exam, passed it, and became a first-class engineer. And at that point, I was still in high school. Ended up very great influence and facilitator for me was the librarian at East Carolina, Wendell Smiley, who also had built a powerful radio station that does not any longer exist at ECU. He hired me as the chief engineer of the station because I had the credential.
And this is as you were still in high school?
I was still in high school.
That's wild.
Yeah, still in high school. And I also got a chance to do some DJing and one thing and another. But the other thing that worked well for me there was, East Carolina really supported me. A year later, they actually sent me to the Institute of Radio Engineers convention in New York City, and paid my expenses, sent me up there, and something I've stayed with. I'm a life member now, but it's now the Institute of Electronic and Electrical, or Electrical and Electronic Engineers. But anyway, it's a worldwide it's the major engineering organization in our field. ECU was a big mover for me, and I got a lot of support out of that. And once I got involved there and so forth, I had opportunities with some of the local radio stations to do some work, and then I spread out somewhat from there. So that was the basis of it. And I actually ended up getting my ham radio license a year after I got my first class license. But I've been a radio ham ever since then, although I'm not right now terribly active, but I still track it.
Yeah, there you go. Now, what was it about radio engineering when you were down in Cuba that just hooked you, that you wanted to learn more about it?
Well, I think it was, as much as anything, I like to do things. Even as a kid, I like to build things, and I was mechanical and so forth. And then I think the other thing was that I didn't. One of the reasons I was in Cuba was to get Spanish, which I had very little of at that point. and we had a family thing. My mother was not enthusiastic about me learning Spanish. My dad wanted me to learn Spanish, tried to teach it to me, but we didn't have that environment. But
Can you speak Spanish now?
yeah, I'm a little rusty, but
So you did eventually learn it then?
oh yeah, and I had quite a bit of formal Spanish at school. I was at East Carolina. And,
Gotcha.
Yeah, in the course of this business, we're not doing a lot of business in Latin America right now, but we in the 80s and 90s we had a lot of business in Latin America. I was down there a lot, traveled a lot, and I was actually quite fluent as a result of that, and we've had relatively little involvement, so I try to use my Spanish anytime I can.
Right.
I read it fluently, but I don't speak it with ease right now. Lack of practice. But
one of the things that fascinates me about people who've been in business for as long as you have is just the things that you've had to overcome, technology changes, even down to societal changes and stuff like that. You've been in business now for 60 years. What is the secret to actually staying in business for multiple decades?
Well, I think part of it is that you have to be situationally aware of what's going on in your business as it is at the moment and that around it. And I think one of the things that has been pivotal for us has been that when technology changes, we know what's happening there and we change our orientation. We were initially in the radio broadcast industry. There wasn't much television back then, but as television developed, we had a key role in that by the time we were well into the 70s in UHF TV, where it expanded so much. Then came the 80s, and we saw cellular on the horizon. Cellular became a much bigger part of our business. AM radio and FM radio had kind of slid away. TV was marginalized for us, and so we've kept a strong emphasis on the cellular technologies through today. We still provide a lot of services for the regulatory compliance, safety, and compatibility, interference compatibility, and so forth for the cell carriers. And we've again pivoted a bit because we're looking at other aspects like the lightning protection. That there are opportunities there for unique approaches, not the stand. We don't get involved like in lightning protection and putting the rods on the roofs and that sort of thing. What we're working with is people like satellite launch companies, various companies that have fields of satellite dishes. We're working with aircraft protection, petroleum protection. So we pick some niches that are not highly trafficked where the needs are developing, and we get in there. But as a small company, you can have some impact. It's very hard as a small company to go into a developed, mature area and take some ground. We do have the advantage that we've been deeply involved in a number of technologies where we were early on, if you would, in them. So if we want to go back into those areas, if there are further developments and so forth, we have the contacts and the credentials to pick up. So what is the old saying? Don't burn your bridges behind you. And we've tried to keep in touch and at least semi-active in some areas that are not major revenue producers for us, but we haven't abandoned them. and we still keep our oar in the water.
So a lot of your business probably just came from word of mouth then, just working with the companies, and then just the work that you did with them just
Yeah,
kind of went from there.
there's a lot to that because
Because you had a reputation built
you get a
behind you as well.
reputation, and fully half of our companies are Fortune 500 companies, and it's very hard to break into those, but you break into them by passage. Oh yeah, we've got this guy that did this project for us. He's the one that needs to do this, and so we have a lot of things pop up that way.
And that probably took some time to get into, right? It wasn't an automatic hit. Like, you didn't get into Fortune 500 companies in your first 5 years, did you?
Oh no, and within the broadcast industry and the later the cellular and the other related technologies that have grown up in the last few years, a big part of our introduction or activity there has been because of we've been relating on high levels. We work very closely with the corporate attorneys and legal staff. As many of the things that we've done in the consulting role of the companies has been support for engineering legal issues. Mm-hmm. And we've got quite a long history of doing expert testimony and doing support for hearing cases and so forth in front of some of the regulatory agencies like the FCC. And in fact, one of the attorneys that I worked with very closely, close personal friend, ended up being for a term being the chairman of the FCC. And we have done a number of programs. I've lectured for the FCC and some of their internal training programs, and also some open to the industry workshop type things I've done for them.
What led me to ask that question is because there's a lot of business owners now, especially during the pandemic. That's when the biggest boom of people that wanted to become self-employed happened. A lot of them want that instant satisfaction to where they want to break into those big markets right off the bat, but they don't realize that it's going to take time and reputation to build up that brand.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for people that are just starting out a business that are just kind of in a rush? Like, slow down a little bit?
Well, first of all, I think you got to look at the kind of business that you're trying to do. If basically what you're trying to do is provide supporting services and so forth, which has been the backbone of what we've done. We've really much more have been a service company than we have been manufacturing or sales. Those are really side things, important things, but and have developed that way. But the core of what we've done for so long has been the consulting services, and those you just have to, you build your reputation up, and it takes a while. You can't, those things are also hard to scale because you can only really go so far unless you start looking at it as a expansion business where you're no longer in the directly services business, but you're in the business of building a company, and that's a whole different business.
Right. Yeah.
And so we've kind of hybrided that as time went on by adding the other companies, the other service and activity lines. But I think if you're going to get into it as a service business, you've got to cultivate contacts. You've got to become known as knowledgeable, as competent, as whatever attributes you want to attach to it. And you've got to be known as being unique. You can't be one of 1,000
right.
competing for the same thing. And a lot of the business that we've gotten over time has been non-compete business. I mean, they want us,
Right.
and so we go for it. Now, if you're, a whole different thing, I think when you're looking at, like, you want to get in a software business, well, that's not going to require the same thing. That's more of a marketing
Yeah.
business. And if you're a good marketeer and you can come up with a solid product, and I guess that's the other part. I mean, you can't do it, at least sustainably, with junk.
Right.
And same thing with our end of the business. You can't have junk people and so forth. We got to have good people, and we've always had some of the top people working with us.
Right.
And you also, I think, again, to this kind of business, you also develop outliers. You work with certain people, maybe individuals, another small company that can do things that you can't, and you make an alliance, or you use those people as consultants and work them into your staff as sort of staff consultants on certain subjects.
It seems like you've had to deal with every single one of these little things in your 60 years of being a business owner.
We've had to deal with a lot of things. We've had to. Fortunately, we've managed to always, even in lean times, keep the financial doors open.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing that you have to be able to deal with, is to understand finances, and to make that a important part of, along with your technical competence, you've got to have financial competence.
Yeah.
And so I've had some good people as CFOs and all over the years too, and generally, like, one of people that helped me most on that for some years was retired from lived in Tarboro, retired from one of the New York Stock Exchange companies, and he was a great advisor. He brought a lot of interesting stuff to us. And the other thing that has been important has been keeping new people in the organization who are working on the cusp of current technology,
Bringing
and so
new
forth.
ideas to the table.
Bringing new ideas in, and new organizational concepts, and so forth. So you end up being, to some degree, orchestra conductor.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have some good teams, you're trying not to dominate them, but that's inevitable to some degree when you've got a lot of background and experience, and some of your people don't, and you always have to worry about stepping on toes and so forth, but you try not to dictate.
Right, right. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, we always hear about the successes when it comes to business and successful businesses, but we never hear about the hard times and the downfalls and stuff like that. In your 60 years of owning and operating your business, did you have to deal with any hard times? Like, for example, anything specifically that you had to overcome, anything that made you just want to possibly throw in the towel? Was there anything like that over these 60 years?
Oh yeah.
Is there anyone that stand out?
Those things happen. Back in the early 70s, we were moving along quite nicely, consulting with radio stations on designing new stations, getting allocations, licenses for new stations, and so forth. And then the Federal Communications Commission, that's key to all of this, decided to lock that down. They weren't going to issue any more till they could figure out what their future strategy was going to be for broadcasting. So suddenly we went to not being able to do anything for any of the people we were working for.
How did you overcome that?
Well, I went into sales. as it happened, they were still, everything that was in there in the FCC's processes was still being handled. It just, nothing new was going in. So here you had these permits coming out for new stations and improvements in stations. And I allied with a company that made radio transmitters for stations. And I ended up getting a 4-state sales territory for them as an independent rep, and started selling. That kind of sales was a little new to me because although I sold a lot, it was not in the hardware kind of area.
It was a service rather than a product.
More of a service.
Yeah.
And that worked out very well for us. I ended up, I've been a pilot since the early 60s when I got my license, but I became active in the early 70s when we bought an airplane. We had 4 states. I had competitors from 4 other companies, but they were all on the ground. And at that time, of course, ground transportation didn't have quite the interstate linkage and everything.
So you figured out a way to move faster.
So I got a plane and got my first plane, used it for a year. It was a little slow. Got a second one that was a Bonanza that was 200 miles an hour.
Yep.
And so then I could have breakfast with a guy in Charleston, South Carolina, and I could have lunch with a customer in, say, Wheeling, West Virginia.
Yeah.
And my competitors are still trying to figure out how to get from A to Z on the back road.
They're waiting on construction traffic right out the door. And
So I drove them crazy because they weren't able to get there. Plus, in 1972 or so, you fly into a little airport out in West Virginia, and you're a celebrity. And the radio station, of course, was a celebrity back then.
Right.
Radio stations were key to so many small communities. So, I would, I would have the time that I might even stay overnight with the station owner and his family. They'd want me to come to dinner, and all that stuff.
And just fly out the next morning.
Yeah, and you've got them for life.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as you stay in touch and everything. And I'd write orders right and left, and it turned out that although I had 4 states, I was responsible for 1/3 of the business of this transmitter company.
Yeah.
And that ended when I almost had parallel operations, but the FCC removed their embargo after several years, I think 2, maybe 3. And of course, then I had a lot of pent-up consulting demand, but also at that point, the transmitter company was getting nervous because they were paying me too much commission. An old story. We need to reduce your commission. You're doing too well.
Yep.
But, well, it just so happens that I'm not doing it anymore because we're going back in the other business.
Yeah.
So by that time, I also had a whole book of stations we'd sold stuff to that were introduced to me that I necessarily had any of their consulting business, but also we did a lot of service and install business. I had a couple of guys on the road doing that. Mm-hmm. I mean, here, they're getting a transmitter in that I sold, 6 months ago. Somebody's got to put it in. Somebody's got to make it work. I had just the guy, and they were very happy that I did.
Yeah.
And so, I guess you want to keep your eye on what's happening. Again, that's a situational awareness thing. Is you take something that is, if you get in hard times, you find something that is contributory to what you're doing. I mean, I had no idea before that freeze hit that I would be out selling transmitters.
And that's the thing about learning from your mistakes. And I mean, I
Yeah.
guess that one really wasn't your fault. That was more of the government decided
Oh
to,
yeah.
put a stop to something. But you got to learn from that. And once that embargo stopped, now you had two businesses instead of one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had just the way things fit together back in the early '60s. I had gotten my pilot's license just because I had some friends who were pilots, and I had back in high school. I enjoyed things like that, so I had joined the local Civil Air Patrol, and we flew around in Piper Cubs and so forth, and played Air Force.
Yeah.
But I had that training that I could immediately go. I went down to South Carolina, to Charleston. Another friend, former business partner in a radio station. I've owned parts of several stations and television stations and all, but he had a aircraft business down there and training and all. So I went down, spent 2 weeks, got up to speed, got recertified, and he also just happened to have a friend in Georgetown, South Carolina, that had a Piper 140 for sale, and hooked me up with that, and so I ended up flying away in a couple of weeks, ready to go, and
Yeah.
hot new pilot,
There you go.
But so it doesn't hurt to pick up a variety of connections and qualifications and all along the way, because you never know when something like that might put you in the way of other opportunity.
Right. Right.
So I was able to do the sales thing, and within a couple of months of getting into that, I'm flying around the territory learning how to sell. But
I'm sure you're having a good time with it.
I was
too.
having a good time, and I also did a little innovating, because I did a lot of driving too. I got one of the first mobile telephones back then.
Nice.
It wasn't cellular; it was a telephone company thing. But I had an antenna up going out the back of my car that went up about 13 feet or so in the air, and where ordinary telephone could only go 15 miles, I could go 25 or 30 with this. So I could be out cruising, talking to clients and all, and that was unique.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody other than contractors and so forth used them right around locally, but I made it into a long distance thing. So I tried to use technology too. And
Yeah. And now you don't have to make a call from 25 miles away. You can call on the other side of the world if you want to, just right now. So
well, and back in the '60s, in the relationship that I had in Washington D.C., we installed one of the first mini computers that there was, and I learned from that. And when I got back here in the mid '70s. We installed one of the first mini computers in Greenville. And I got a young lady from East Carolina who had just gotten her degree in computer science, who was told, don't work for him, you need to work for IBM, right?
Yeah.
But no, she persisted and was with me for many years, and we went through several big computers as they were, PDP 42, and so forth, took its own room, but we were highly computerized back. Well, things were still in a manual era, and a lot of our projects were run from a technical standpoint on computer solutions and so forth.
It seemed like you always tried to stay one step ahead.
Well,
that's what it seemed like.
We do, and that again, I still use that word, kind of situational awareness. What's coming down the road, and do we need it? Is it something that can do a good thing for us? I mean, here right now, we've got all of our computer activities on the cloud, where we can work from. I've got a little office set up at the house. I've got another one down at North Topsail Beach, where I have an office, and it's all transparent. I can do whatever from any place. Plus, my smartphone is tied in, so now, I'm fully connected. Not that I always know what buttons to push.
Yeah.
That I'm not a techno geek in terms of being able to always make connections and make things work. But I've got a pretty good idea of it, and that was also, from a sales standpoint, one of our early things was we were number like 65,000 in the era of URLs for our LBAgroup.com. And that was 1996 when we made that active. Nobody knew what it was. Basically, it was Geeksville.
Yeah.
But we put up a site that we've kept evolving since then. So that's now almost 30 years that we've been on the web.
Yeah.
And we've used, and that's a very big part of our intake for new business is off of that.
When it comes down to looking back in your 60 years of doing this, you starting out in that radio station right there, is there anything that you would go and mentor your younger self if you could go back in time?
No, I think I've been quite lucky on the path that I've taken. The thing I would have done maybe a little differently is gotten a little broader circle of advisors outside of the field, just again for the look ahead and for what's smart to do right now. Now, not too much so, because a lot of people who advise you are advising you in what happened before, not what's going ahead. So just association, and that's always been like with working with the Washington legal community tightly as I have and all. You see a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of news there that you're not going to get otherwise. And up until the 9/11 situation, I used to fly to Washington at least a couple of times a month just to have lunch with people up there that I knew. And by the way, that's when our aviation business ended. The LBA Air, as we called it, disappeared in the Floyd flood.
Oh, no.
Yes, sir. The plane, unfortunately, was sitting at the Greenville airport, and the propeller was off the plane as part of an overhaul.
Right by the Tar River?
Yep, just as the waters were rising. So
oh, man.
It was a pitiful sight that when the waters went down, the thing was mud top to bottom.
You've mentioned this twice now, how you would stay overnight at a client's house, have dinner with their family, you would fly to DC to have dinner with some colleagues. How important is those relationships outside of the business? I mean, clearly you're having business conversations, but just spending time with your clients outside of that business sector, how important is that?
Oh, it is in a lot of ways to me. I mean, first of all, on a grand scale, getting to know the country. I mean, just knowing something of what's going on, where places are, and so forth. Just a quick kind of fun example.
Go for it.
I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and one of my staff and I were there for a meeting, and that night we went down to Music Row, Bourbon Street, and we're in this little country bar, and there was a young lady that was singing, and she came over after her set and chatting with her, and she was 18 and she was just trying to make her way in Nashville. And I said, well, where are you from? And she said, well, I'm from West Virginia. And I said, well, where? She said, oh, you wouldn't know it. It's just a little town in West Virginia. I said, well, what's a little town? She said, Oak Hill. I said, oh, I know Oak Hill. And she says, you're putting me on. And I said, no. I said, gave her the call sign of the radio station. I said, we work with my best friend's the son of the guy who runs it. And I said, well, great. And I said, and you got to, I remember eating breakfast at one of the best little cafes up at Oak Hill, and Bubba's Cafe or whatever it was. Oh, you know that? Oh my God, you really do know Oak Hill?
Yeah.
You know, it was that kind of, I mean, that's fun stuff, but I mean, you get to know different parts of the country. I think we've had, I think there are only 2 states that I've never been in.
Yeah.
And I think that's, what would that, Wyoming and Idaho.
I've been to Wyoming. Wyoming's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But everything else, there's, including Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Alaska and so forth. But just from I mean, it's certainly useful when something comes up and somebody says, oh, this is whatever in Nebraska. I say, yeah, okay, I got a general idea anyway of what we're talking about. I've seen the country to
Your
some
world
degree.
gets smaller because you can talk to someone and oh, they probably know someone that you know.
And that's true. What is the 6 points of separation or something? But yes, it's but it's good for business too, because you'd be talking to somebody on the telephone and they say, well, I'm from Ohio, and oh, where in Ohio? Oh yeah, I know where that is. We had a client up there.
Yeah.
And it immediately gives you a point of connection when you're both floating around here trying to make some connection on business.
Yeah.
And you can make a connection on knowing an area.
Something completely outside of the business itself.
Yeah, completely outside of the business, or just I like boats, and I like.
Yeah. Well, it starts to give you some common ground with that person that you just met.
So there's always, if you have enough real things that you've got at least some commonality to, so often you can immediately grasp something. Oh. Yeah, I had a sailboat for a while. I really love sailing, and I'm like, what kind have you got? Oh, I've got a 32-foot Beneteau. Oh, that's a beautiful sailboat. Now you're standing the same level for a moment. Yeah. And that, if there's, you're talking about what you might do if you were getting into business, you look for those opportunities, and it might be sports, it might be a lot of things, but the more unique it is, the better chance you've got of getting a relationship started and talking about it, because you'll certainly know somebody somewhere that boats, for instance, is that, oh, we both went to the Annapolis Boat Show 3 years ago. Wow, and now business is important, but you got a personal tie, and I would just suggest to other people that they look for those things. Ham radio has been a great one for me, even though I'm by no means the most active person in it, but there are 200, 300,000 ham operators in the U.S. So you run into a ham and you immediately got something to at least touch on.
Right.
And that could be a lot of other interests. You might be interested in another one of mine that's always been good as a conversation thing is I'm a hiker. I've loved hiking and and so if somebody is outdoors oriented and the conversation happens to hit in that direction, suddenly you're talking about trails you've been on or expeditions or whatever. I don't look consciously to do that. I just enjoy these different things.
You enjoy the conversation.
And so I enjoy the conversations, and the more unique the subject of commonality, the better the discussion.
Right.
And it helps me in my Latin American activities. My dad is Latino, or was, and you know, those kind of things. So my sister lives in Montreal, and she's now a Canadian citizen, but we do business in Canada, and it's a great opener is that, oh, my sister lives in Montreal. Oh, your sister is in Montreal. Yeah, she's Canadian, you know, and
so that whole story unravels after that,
Yeah, I mean, so people just need to expand along with their business interests. You can't just simply be oriented on whatever the core of your business is, and that's what I do, that's all I know. That limits you in terms of...
Because no one's going to want to talk to you.
They're not going to want to talk to you, not as an introductory thing anyway. But
right.
And then too, you know, and having a unique business is a good starter when you just run into people at random and they want to know what you're doing. And ours is kind of a little hard to explain in a quick elevator thing, but just some of the buzzwords, electromagnetics, and immediately, well, what's that? You know? So now you have an opportunity to talk more about it. And so that's an important thing to carry with you. So those are just some of the skills that I see that would be helpful.
And I think the biggest takeaway I've gotten from the conversation with you and the advice is just, you know, being a people person, and just doesn't always have to be about the business itself. Yes, it has to wrap eventually back around to it, but just finding that commonality with someone, you can just relate to them on a human level.
Yeah.
So, Lawrence, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Been fun.
It has been. It has been. How do we find more about LBA Group, about you? Tell me all about that part.
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Facebook as well. Then it's lbagroup.com is our URL, and
that you've had since 1996.
And that's the one we've had since '96, and that's where a lot of our information is.
Cool.
And so I'd invite anybody to come to that, and that's got contact information as well.
And you guys are located in Greenville, North Carolina.
Greenville, and that's the home base.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, Lawrence, I appreciate it.
Okay, good to talk to you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, you as well.
Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and thanks so much for watching. For more on Black Tie Optional, subscribe on YouTube by hitting the notification bell or follow us on social media. Black Tie Optional also streams across all podcast platforms, so the next time you're in the car or at the gym, look us up by typing in Black Tie Optional Podcast. Again, thanks so much for watching and listening, and until next time, stay motivated.